good King Wenceslas looked out today, the Feast of Stephen, the second day of Christmas. If you don't know the story of St. Stephen, Stephen was one of the first deacons in the church. There were some issues in the early church in the book of Acts about enough people being fed and how the food was going to be distributed and how the poor were going to be taken care of. And so the disciples, who are now the elders, the pastors of the church, the elders, then appointed deacons. Diakonoi in Greek means to serve. And these people's job was to serve the people around them. Their job was to act in justice ministries. So the apostles' job was to preach and proclaim, and the deacon's job became very much about sharing the good news, sharing the goods of the community to those who had most need. Stephen was proclaiming the news of Jesus' birth, of the goodness of the Messiah. He was approached by the Sanhedrin, who he then proclaimed boldly. He chastised them for not listening to the words of Jesus and for playing a part in the persecution of Christ, and in turn, the persecution of Christians. They turned on Stephen. Stephen became, in turn, the first martyr, being stoned for his faith. What does this story have to do with Christmas? Everything, if we're honest. Advent is the time we watched and we prayed. We prepared our hearts. Excuse me. We prepared our hearts for what? We prepared our hearts to receive Jesus again. But the question that the Feast of Stephen reminds us is, which Jesus did we prepare for? The sweet baby of Bethlehem or the Messiah of Nazareth and Judea and Jerusalem? We love babies, don't we? They're so cute and they smell good most of the time. And babies, honestly, are relatively easy. I mean, they keep you up at night and you're exhausted, but really, other than feeding and diapering and cuddling and loving, I mean, they really don't demand a whole lot from us. But as anyone who's had children know, the more they grow, the more they demand, and the harder they get. They grow and demand more of us. Jesus, the baby, is in turn sweet and kind and nice, and we love him. But Jesus, the Messiah, full of demands, full of expectations. I think it's easier to love baby Jesus than it is Messiah Christ. It's easy to sugarcoat Jesus, right? We sing those songs, what a friend we have in Jesus. It feels good to love the kind, nice, and gentle Jesus. But Jesus was not a sweet man. Let me assure you, Jesus was a godly man. And sometimes it meant being sweet. But sometimes it meant being gruff and abrasive. Sometimes it meant going against the grain if that piece of wood was in fact being used to clobber people and oppress and offend God. Jesus was not afraid of going against that grain, and neither should we. Stephen stood to tell the truth of God's love in Jesus. It offended the religious leaders of his day, and it cost him his life. Now, I'm not saying we need to be offensive. I'm not saying we should be offensive. But I'm saying we do need to be faithful, even if that offends. Saying yes to Jesus means saying yes to his life, his message, and his way. And that means putting our own popularity on hold. This morning, I saw the news of the death of Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Interestingly enough, I wrote this sermon and made reference to Desmond Tutu. Archbishop Tutu knew this truth of Jesus' message in life when he stood against apartheid. He said this: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have just taken the side of the oppressor. If you are neutral in the situations of injustice, then you have just taken the side of the oppressor. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this when he preached very unpopular things and called a nation and a Christian church to account. The great prophets of the Old Testament knew that their calling too, as they stood squarely against the powers that be. Strong women in our own history, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, stood strong against oppression and violence against women. Troy Perry stood in the rubble of burned-out buildings, even gay bars, because they were the only places which would hold services of Christian religion for LGBT people when churches in the 1960s didn't want us. The truth is, when we welcome the newborn Jesus into our lives, we cannot also not welcome the Messiah. That's the point. You can't have one and not also have the other. Because to have the Christ of Bethlehem without the Christ of Calvary means you don't know what the Christ of Bethlehem ever really meant to begin with. And that's a really hard message for us to swallow. It means living a harder life. It means our choices, our actions, our behaviors, our words aren't always ours anymore. We might want to climb the corporate ladder, but we can't do it if it means selling our integrity. We might have the urge to cheat or hedge the truth just a little bit to make ourselves feel more important, or maybe to save a little money on our taxes or in a shopping mall. But we can't do it if getting a better deal means we sell our soul. We can cheat, but at what cost? We might be better served by keeping our mouths shut in the face of oppression, but what does that say about our complicity in oppression of those around us? I was reminded today of a story about my own son, a phone call I got from his teacher when he was in the first grade. Mrs. Gosshorn called me up and she said, "Pastor Rob, I need to talk to you about Ryan's behavior." Okay. It seems Ryan was in the bus line at the Shade Gap Elementary School. There was a little boy behind him from our church. Nathan had a speech impediment. There was another boy, also a year older, who was making fun of the way he spoke. My son said, "Don't make fun of him." He kept doing it. My son said again, "Stop making fun of him." The boy pushed my son, so my son clocked him in the nose. Mrs. Gosshorn said, "Pastor Rob, I can't accept this. This isn't okay. If it happens again, I'm going to have to send it to the principal, and he's probably going to get suspended in first grade." I said, "Mrs. Gosshorn, I understand that. I will have a talk with my son today when he comes home about violence. And it's never appropriate to punch someone in the nose. But I'll also take my son out for ice cream and congratulate him on standing up for justice. And I will tell my son that while violence is never appropriate, sometimes being a person of faith means we stand up against bullies. And we teach them that it's not okay to taunt, to demean, and to degrade other people to make ourselves feel good. So yes, suspend him if you must, but I will congratulate my son for standing up for someone who was too scared to stand up for himself." Stephen reminds us that the gospel isn't always tinsel and garlands and bows and packages. Sometimes it's also tough truths. It's challenging the establishment and calling people to accountability for their behaviors. Sometimes, like Stephen, we're going to get the backlash of those who don't approve of our message. Sometimes, like Stephen, we're going to get stoned because people stone the messenger when they don't like the message. But like Stephen, we're also called to faithfulness, not popularity. In this very church, being prophetic meant a stance to become open and affirming when other churches in town weren't ready. In this church, being prophetic meant making a safe space for homeless folk to come every single day. And that journey has not always been pleasant. It's not always been easy. But we've maneuvered, we've worked with it, and it's been a blessing for all of us. In this place, being prophetic means becoming a safe space for refugees who just want a place to start a new life. It's nice to be both faithful and popular. Sometimes that can happen. But when it can't, like Stephen, we're told to keep our eyes fixed upward, to stand faithful to the Christ, the one we proclaim is born anew in us this day. Amen.